Did you really go to Columbus last weekend or were you in Maine?
Neil Hargrove noticed the receipt first, crumpled between the pages of Elaine's book like a forgotten bookmark. White paper, black ink, unmistakable header, Pine Shore Resort and Spa, Bar Harbor, Maine. 2 rooms, 3 nights. Total, $2,847. His wife of 23 years had never mentioned Maine. Neil smoothed the receipt against his kitchen counter, studying the dates. Last weekend. The same weekend Elaine claimed she was visiting her sister in Columbus with their daughter Morgan. The same weekend he'd worked double shifts at the warehouse, covering for sick drivers, earning overtime they desperately needed for Morgan's student loan payments. The receipt showed cocktails, spa treatments, room service for four. Neil folded the paper into perfect thirds and slipped it into his wallet. Outside, November rain pelted their modest Cedar Hill home, the same 2-story colonial they'd bought when Morgan was 5. Same beige siding, same creaky front steps, same mortgage payment that kept him working 50-hour weeks at Midwest Distribution Solutions. Nothing had changed in their neighborhood, but something had shifted in his house. Elaine emerged from their bedroom, hair still damp from her shower, wearing the silk robe he'd given her last Christmas. She looked radiant in a way that made Neil's chest tighten. "Morning, honey," Elaine said, kissing his cheek. Her skin smelled different. Not her usual lavender body wash. Something floral and expensive. "How was Columbus?" Neil asked, pouring coffee into her favorite mug. "Oh, you know how it is with my sister." Elaine waved her hand dismissively. She needed someone to listen to her complain about Roger's retirement plans. Morgan was a saint for coming with me. Neil nodded, studying his wife's face. 23 years of marriage had taught him to read her expressions like weather patterns. Right now, she was too bright, too animated for someone who'd spent 3 days listening to complaints. "Did you and Morgan have time to do anything fun?" he asked. "We drove around the old neighborhood where she grew up, went to that little cafe she loves." Elaine's answers came quickly, practiced. "Nothing too exciting." Neil handed her the coffee. "Sounds nice." His phone buzzed. A text from Morgan. "Thanks for covering the spa weekend, Dad. Mom needed it after all the stress at work. Love you." Neil's blood went cold. Morgan thought he'd paid for the trip, which meant Elaine had lied to both of them about who was funding their weekend getaway. "I need to check something at the office," Neil said, grabbing his keys. "Emergency with the Jacksonville shipment." "On Saturday?" Elaine looked concerned. "Can't someone else handle it?" "Not this time." Neil kissed her forehead, tasting the lie between them. "I'll be back for dinner." He drove to the warehouse but didn't go inside. Instead, he sat in his truck staring at Morgan's text, processing the implications. His daughter, his brilliant, impulsive daughter who'd graduated summa cum laude from Ohio State, thought he'd paid nearly $3,000 for a spa weekend he'd never authorized. Someone else had footed the bill, someone with enough money to treat 2 women to a luxury weekend without thinking twice about the cost. Neil opened his laptop and logged into their joint checking account. No charges to Pine Shore Resort, no unusual withdrawals, which meant whoever paid for the trip either used cash or paid directly. He thought about Elaine's new perfume, her glowing skin, the way she'd been humming in the shower for the past month, singing songs he didn't recognize. His phone rang. Dylan, their son-in-law. "Hey, Mr. Hargrove." Dylan's voice sounded strained. "Is Morgan with you guys today?" "No, she's probably at home. Why?" "She's not answering her phone. We had plans this morning, but she never showed up." "This isn't like her." Neil's throat tightened. "When did you last talk to her?" "Yesterday morning, before she left for work. She seemed different, distracted, like her mind was somewhere else." "Different how?" "I don't know. Secretive, maybe? She's been acting weird since that trip with your wife. More confident, but also more distant. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. Neil thanked Dylan and hung up, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. He drove home to find Elaine in the kitchen, prepping vegetables for dinner. Classical music played from her phone, a new habit she'd developed recently. Dylan called looking for Morgan, Neil said. She missed their plans today. Elaine didn't look up from chopping carrots. "She's probably shopping. You know how she gets when she finds a good sale." "He said she's been acting different since your trip." Now Elaine paused, her knife hovering over the cutting board. "Different how?" "More confident, more secretive." Elaine resumed chopping, her movements deliberate. "Maybe she's finally growing up, learning to be independent." "She's 25 and married, Elaine. She's been independent for years." "You know what I mean?" Elaine's voice carried an edge Neil hadn't heard before. Sometimes people need to explore who they really are, what they really want. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning Neil wasn't sure he wanted to unpack. That night, Neil lay awake, listening to Elaine breathe beside him. Her sleep seemed deeper lately, more satisfied, like someone who'd discovered something that had been missing. At 3 a.m., he slipped out of bed and went to his home office. He opened his laptop and started researching Pine Shore Resort and Spa. The website showed elegant rooms, pristine beaches, couples packages that cost more than he made in a week. The guest reviews mentioned the resort's discretion, its privacy, the kind of place where wealthy people went to conduct business they didn't want discussed in their hometown. Neil found the resort's Instagram page and scrolled through tagged photos. Couples holding champagne glasses, families on the beach, groups of friends celebrating birthdays and anniversaries. Then, he found it. A photo posted 6 days ago by someone named at coastal_Craig. 4 people sitting around a restaurant table, faces flushed with wine and laughter. The caption read, "New friends make the best adventures. #Pine Shore # unexpected connections." 2 of the faces belonged to his wife and daughter. Neil screenshotted the image and enlarged it. Elaine wore a dress he'd never seen, her hair styled in loose waves that framed her face perfectly. Morgan sat beside her, glowing with the same radiant energy that had been radiating from Elaine since their return. The 2 men in the photo were strangers, well-dressed, confident, probably in their early 50s. One had his arm around the back of Elaine's chair. The other was leaning close to Morgan, whispering something that made her laugh. Neil clicked on Coastal Craig's profile. Craig Lawton, DDS, private practice in Cedar Hill, married to Sandra Lawton, mother of 2 teenage boys. His bio mentioned his love of sailing, fine wine, and living life to the fullest. The other man's profile was private, but Craig had tagged him in several photos, at Mike_Lawton_architect. Probably Craig's brother or cousin based on the shared last name. Neil spent the next hour scrolling through Craig's Instagram, building a timeline. The man posted frequently, photos of expensive dinners, sailing trips, dental conferences, and exotic locations. His wife Sandra appeared in maybe 10% of the photos, usually looking tired or distracted. But in the recent Pine Shore photos, Craig looked energized, younger, like a man who discovered something that made him feel alive again. Neil recognized the expression because he'd been seeing it on his wife's face for weeks. Sunday morning brought the first real test of his suspicions. Elaine announced she was meeting Morgan for brunch. Just us girls. Neil said he had to catch up on paperwork at the office. Instead, he parked outside the trendy cafe downtown where Elaine claimed they'd be eating. He waited for 2 hours. Neither his wife nor his daughter appeared. At noon, he drove to Morgan and Dylan's apartment. Dylan answered the door in pajamas, looking like he hadn't slept. "She's at brunch with Mom," Dylan said. "Girl time or whatever. At Maple Street Cafe? I guess. She didn't say exactly where." Neil nodded, filing away another lie. He returned home to find Elaine unpacking shopping bags from stores he knew she couldn't afford on her dental office manager's salary. "How was brunch?" he asked. "Lovely. Morgan's doing so well. She's really found herself lately." "What did you buy?" Elaine held up a silk scarf that probably cost more than their monthly electric bill. Morgan insisted. She said I deserved something beautiful. That was generous of her. She's been very generous lately. We both have. The way she said it made Neil's skin crawl. There was something proprietary in her tone, like she was discussing a business transaction rather than family time. That afternoon, Neil installed keystroke logging software on their shared computer while Elaine napped. The program would record every website visited, every password entered, every message typed. He felt sick doing it, but his marriage had crossed into territory where normal rules no longer applied. By Monday evening, he had his first real evidence. Elaine had been messaging someone called Clawton47 on a dating app called Discretion. The app's tagline, "For people who understand that life is complicated." The messages went back 6 weeks, starting with casual conversation about wine preferences and travel destinations. By week 3, they were discussing meeting in person. By week 4, they were planning the main trip. The most recent message, sent that morning while Neil was at work, read, "Can't stop thinking about this weekend. When can we do it again? E wants to know if M can bring D next time." Neil read the message 3 times before understanding hit him. E was Elaine, M was Morgan, D was Dylan. His wife and daughter were planning to involve Dylan in whatever arrangement they'd made with Craig and his companion. Neil closed the laptop and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon. Then he sat in his office, staring at the wall, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd discovered. His wife wasn't just having an affair. She was recruiting their daughter. And now they wanted to drag Dylan into their web of deception. The bourbon burned his throat, but not as much as the realization that he didn't know the woman he'd been married to for over 2 decades. Tuesday brought a phone call that changed everything. "Mr. Hargrove? This is Dr. Patterson from Cedar Hill Family Medicine. I need you to come in for a consultation regarding some test results." Neil's chest tightened. "Test results? I haven't had any tests done." "Your wife brought in samples for STD screening. She listed you as her emergency contact and said you'd requested joint testing due to some symptoms you'd been experiencing." The office spun around Neil. "I never requested any testing." "Sir, I think there may be some confusion. Could you come in this afternoon? There are some results we need to discuss privately with both you and your wife." Neil drove to the medical office in a daze. Dr. Patterson, a gray-haired man Neil had known for 15 years, looked uncomfortable as he delivered the news. "The tests show positive results for chlamydia," Dr. Patterson said. "Both you and your wife. The good news is it's completely treatable with antibiotics. The concerning part is that untreated chlamydia can cause serious complications, especially in women. Doctor, I haven't been sexually active with anyone but my wife in over 20 years, and we haven't been intimate in about 3 months." Dr. Patterson's expression shifted from professional concern to barely concealed alarm. "Mr. Hargrove, if that's true, then we need to discuss some difficult possibilities." Neil left the doctor's office with a prescription he didn't need and knowledge that felt like swallowing glass. Elaine had contracted an STD from someone else and somehow believed Neil was also infected, which meant she'd been planning to claim they both caught it from each other, covering her tracks while implicating him in her deception. That evening, Neil confronted Elaine with surgical precision. "Dr. Patterson called today," he said over dinner, "about our test results." Elaine's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Oh, right. I forgot to mention I'd made us appointments. Why would you think we needed STD testing?" "I've been having some discomfort. Probably nothing, but I thought we should both get checked. Just to be safe." Neil nodded slowly. The results came back positive. "Positive?" Elaine's face went pale. "For what?" "Chlamydia. Both of us, apparently." Elaine stared at her plate, her breathing shallow. "How is that possible?" "That's what I'd like to know. Maybe it's been dormant. I read that can happen sometimes. Old infections that never got properly treated." Neil watched his wife manufacture explanations in real time, her mind working through possibilities that would absolve her of responsibility. "Dr. Patterson says that's extremely unlikely," Neil said. "He thinks one of us was recently exposed." "Well, it wasn't me." Elaine's voice rose defensively. "I haven't been with anyone but you. Neither have I." They stared at each other across their dinner table, the silence stretching like a wire about to snap. "Maybe there was contamination at the lab," Elaine said finally. "False positives happen all the time." Neil nodded, playing along with her desperate rationalization. "Maybe," but he could see the truth in her eyes. She knew exactly how she'd contracted the infection. And she'd been hoping to drag him down with her, creating a shared problem that would eliminate questions about its origin. That night, Neil moved to the guest bedroom, claiming he wanted to avoid reinfection while they both took antibiotics. Elaine accepted the explanation with obvious relief. Neil spent the sleepless hours planning his next moves with the methodical precision that had made him successful in logistics. Every problem had a solution if you broke it down into manageable components. Component 1, intelligence gathering. He needed to understand the full scope of Elaine and Morgan's activities before taking action. Component 2, asset protection. Whatever was coming would likely involve legal complications. He needed to safeguard their finances and property. Component 3, documentation. Everything had to be recorded, verified, and legally admissible. Component 4, leverage. He needed information that would give him control over the situation's outcome. Wednesday morning, Neil called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the warehouse, he drove to the office of Tommy Brennan, an old friend from his union days who'd transitioned into corporate consulting after a career as a labor negotiator. Tommy's office occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Cedar Hill. The walls were covered with photographs from 30 years of handling delicate situations for companies that needed problems to disappear quietly. "Neil Hargrove," Tommy said, standing up from behind his desk. been a long time. What brings you to my corner of the world? I need advice, off the record. Tommy gestured to a chair across from his desk. That's what I do. What's the situation? Neil laid out the facts without emotion or editorializing. The Maine trip, the Instagram photos, the dating app messages, the STD diagnosis. Tommy listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad. Your wife's having an affair, Tommy said when Neil finished. Probably been going on longer than you think. The daughter's either participating or being manipulated into participating. Either way, you're looking at a divorce that could get very ugly very quickly. I don't want a divorce. Tommy raised an eyebrow. What do you want? I want them to understand the consequences of their choices. I want them to face what they've done without being able to shift blame or play sufferer. That's a dangerous road, Neil. Revenge has a way of spiraling out of control. This isn't revenge, it's accountability. Tommy studied Neil's face for a long moment. What kind of help are you looking for? Information, documentation, and some creative thinking about how to handle a complex situation without breaking any laws. That I can do. But it'll cost you. How much? $5,000 up front. Another $5,000 when we're done. And Neil? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. You sure this is how you want to handle it? Neil thought about Elaine's lies. Morgan's betrayal. The STD he hadn't contracted, but was expected to take responsibility for. I'm sure. Tommy opened his desk drawer and pulled out a contract. Then let's get started. Over the next week, Tommy's team conducted surveillance that revealed the full scope of Neil's family's deception. Craig Lawton was indeed having an affair with Elaine, but the situation was more complex than a simple extramarital relationship. Craig and his companion, identified as his brother Mike, were part of what Tommy's investigator called a lifestyle arrangement. They specialized in introducing married couples to open relationships, often targeting women in unfulfilling marriages and gradually expanding their social circles. Elaine and Morgan had been recruited during a dental conference Craig attended in Columbus. Elaine had been there for a continuing education seminar. Morgan had accompanied her for what they'd described to Neil as mother-daughter bonding time. The Pine Shore trip had been Elaine and Morgan's initiation into Craig's social network. The plan, based on intercepted communications, was to gradually introduce Dylan to the arrangement, presenting it as a way for their marriage to become more exciting and modern. Your daughter doesn't know she's being groomed, Tommy explained during their Friday meeting. She thinks she's discovered some kind of enlightened approach to relationships. Your wife is more aware of what's happening, but she's convinced herself it's empowerment rather than manipulation. What about Dylan? He's starting to suspect something's wrong. My guy observed him following your daughter last Tuesday. He's picked up on her behavior changes but doesn't understand what's causing them. Neil absorbed the information with growing clarity about what needed to happen next. I want to record a conversation between Elaine and Morgan, he said, something that documents their intentions and their attitude toward what they're doing. That's legally complicated in Ohio. You can't record someone without their consent unless you're part of the conversation. Then I'll be part of the conversation. Tommy leaned back in his chair. What did you have in mind? That weekend, Neil implemented a plan that would have made his logistics supervisors proud. He told Elaine he'd been invited to a fishing trip with some guys from work, leaving Friday evening and returning Sunday night. Instead, he checked into a motel 20 minutes from their house and waited. Saturday afternoon, Elaine invited Morgan over for what she described to Neil as girl time while you're gone. Neil knew better. He'd been monitoring their communications and knew they were planning to discuss their next moves with Craig and Mike. Neil returned home Saturday evening, using his key to enter quietly through the back door. He could hear voices from the living room, Elaine and Morgan, along with a third voice he didn't recognize. He activated the recording app on his phone and moved closer to the conversation. Can't keep lying to Dylan forever, Morgan was saying. He's getting suspicious about where I've been going. Honey, you're not lying, a male voice responded. Craig, you're just being selective about what you share until he's ready to understand. But what if he's never ready? Morgan asked. What if he doesn't want this kind of relationship? Then you'll have to decide what's more important, Elaine said. Your marriage or your happiness? Neil felt something cold settle in his chest as he listened to his wife encourage their daughter to potentially destroy her marriage. I just wish I could make him see how amazing this could be, Morgan continued. How much better our relationship could become if we could just be honest about our needs. Give it time, Craig said. Most men come around eventually, especially when they realize how much their wives are enjoying themselves. There was laughter, and the sound of it made Neil's hands shake. "Mom, do you think Dad suspects anything?" Morgan asked. "Your father," Elaine's voice carried a note of dismissive amusement. "Neil doesn't suspect anything. He's completely absorbed in his work and his routines. I could probably bring Craig home for dinner and he wouldn't notice." More laughter. "He's actually kind of pathetic when you think about it," Elaine continued. 23 years of marriage and he still thinks I'm the same woman he married. He has no idea who I really am or what I really want." "What about when he finds out about the STD?" Craig's voice carried concern. "I handled it. I told him we both tested positive and convinced him it was probably dormant from years ago. He believed it completely. He actually felt guilty about it." The three of them found this hilarious. Neil stopped recording and retreated to his car, his entire body shaking with rage and disgust. He drove back to the motel and spent the night planning their destruction with the same methodical approach he used for complex shipping logistics. By Sunday morning, he had a timeline. Phase 1 would focus on documentation and asset protection. Phase 2 would involve strategic information disclosure. Phase 3 would be the systematic dismantling of their lives, piece by piece, until they understood exactly what their choices had cost. Neil returned home Sunday evening to find Elaine cooking his favorite dinner, humming the same unknown songs she'd been singing for weeks. "How was the fishing trip?" she asked, kissing his cheek with lips that had been lying to him for months. "Productive," Neil said. "Very productive." Monday morning began Phase 1. Neil met with a divorce attorney, not to file paperwork, but to understand his legal options and obligations. He learned about Ohio's infidelity laws, property division requirements, and the documentation needed to prove marital misconduct. Tuesday, he opened new bank accounts at a different institution, slowly moving money from their joint accounts in amounts small enough to avoid triggering alerts. He told Elaine he was reorganizing their finances to get better interest rates. Wednesday, he met with a real estate attorney to explore transferring their house into a trust that would protect the property from potential legal judgments. The attorney recommended a specific structure that would take several weeks to implement properly. Thursday, he installed additional recording equipment in their home, devices Tommy's team had provided that looked like standard electrical outlets and smoke detectors, but captured audio from every room. Friday brought the first major piece of leverage Neil needed. Tommy called with news that Craig's wife, Sandra, had hired a private investigator. She'd discovered her husband's affairs and was building a case for divorce that would leave Craig financially devastated. "She wants to meet with you," Tommy said. "Today, if possible." Neil met Sandra Lawton at a coffee shop across town from Craig's dental practice. She was a thin, sharp-featured woman in her late 40s who looked like she'd been crying for weeks. "I know about your wife," Sandra said without preamble, "and your daughter. Craig's been documenting his conquests like they're hunting trophies." She showed Neil photographs on her phone, images Craig had taken during private moments with Elaine and Morgan. The pictures were intimate, degrading, and obviously taken without the women's knowledge or consent. "He's done this before," Sandra continued. "At least 6 other families over the past 3 years. He finds unhappy wives, seduces them, then gradually involves other family members. It's like a game to him." Neil studied the photos with detached fury. "What's your timeline for divorce proceedings?" "I'm filing Monday. I wanted to give you a chance to protect yourself first." "What kind of protection?" Sandra pulled out a manila envelope. "Copies of everything. Financial records, photos, communications between Craig and your family members. My attorney says if you move quickly, you can use this information to minimize your exposure in divorce proceedings." Neil accepted the envelope, feeling its weight like a loaded weapon. "There's something else," Sandra said. "Craig's been bragging to his brother about how easy your wife and daughter were to manipulate. He recorded some of those conversations. I have copies. I want to hear them." Sandra handed him a small digital recorder. "The worst one is from last Tuesday, after they met with you about the STD results." That evening, Neil listened to Craig's voice, describing in crude detail how he'd convinced Elaine to get tested for STDs and implicate Neil in the infection. "The beautiful part," Craig's voice said on the recording, "is that she actually thinks she's protecting herself by dragging him into it. She has no idea that by the time this blows up, she'll be taking all the blame while I walk away clean." Neil's brother Mike could be heard laughing in the background. "What about the daughter?" "Morgan's even easier. She thinks she's discovered some kind of sophisticated lifestyle. Really, she's just another suburban housewife who got bored with her marriage. When this falls apart, she'll lose everything and never understand why. The recording continued for 20 more minutes, with Craig describing his plans to dispose of both women once he'd extracted maximum entertainment value from the situation. Neil turned off the recorder and sat in his car outside the coffee shop, finally understanding the true scope of what his family had walked into. They weren't having affairs. They were being victimized by a hunter who specialized in destroying families for sport. But they were also willing participants who'd lied, cheated, and attempted to drag him into their web of deception. Both things could be true, and both deserved consequences. Neil drove home to find Elaine getting ready for another evening out with friends. She wore the silk dress from the Maine trip and the perfume that had become her signature scent since meeting Craig. "Will you be late?" Neil asked. "Probably." "Don't wait up." She kissed his forehead like she was blessing a child, then walked out of their house toward a night of betraying everything they'd built together. Neil waited 30 minutes, then followed her. The restaurant was upscale, the kind of place that required reservations and charged $40 for entrees. Through the window, Neil could see Elaine at a corner table with Craig, Morgan, and Dylan. Dylan looked uncomfortable. His posture was rigid, his responses minimal. Morgan kept touching his arm, trying to draw him into the conversation, but he seemed resistant to her attempts at closeness. Neil watched Craig work, observing the subtle techniques the man used to manipulate social dynamics. Craig ordered expensive wine, complimented everyone lavishly, and gradually steered the conversation toward topics that normalized the kind of relationship arrangements he was promoting. After 2 hours, the group left the restaurant. Craig kissed Elaine goodbye in the parking lot, not a friendly peck, but a possessive claiming that left no doubt about their relationship status. Morgan hugged her mother, then got into a car with Dylan. Even from 50 yards away, Neil could see they were arguing. Neil followed Dylan and Morgan back to their apartment, parking across the street in time to see them enter their building. The lights in their second-floor unit came on immediately, and through the thin curtains, Neil could see their silhouettes engaged in animated discussion. 20 minutes later, Dylan emerged from the building carrying a duffel bag. He got into his car and drove away, leaving Morgan alone. Neil's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Your son-in-law just showed up at my door asking if he can sleep on my couch. Thought you should know." Rick Paulson. Rick was Dylan's best friend from high school. The fact that Dylan had fled to Rick's house instead of calling Neil directly suggested that whatever had happened in that apartment was serious enough to fracture Dylan and Morgan's marriage. Neil drove home to find Elaine still absent. He went to his office and began implementing phase 2 of his plan. First, he copied all of Sandra Lawton's evidence onto multiple storage devices, organizing the files by date and relevance. The material would serve as insurance against any attempt by Craig or his associates to retaliate. Second, he created anonymous email accounts and began crafting messages to key figures in Craig's professional network: the Ohio State Dental Board, the Better Business Bureau, the landlord who rented space to Craig's practice. Third, he composed a detailed letter to Dylan, explaining everything he discovered about Morgan and Elaine's activities. The letter included copies of communications, photographs, and audio recordings that would help Dylan understand he wasn't losing his mind. His wife really had betrayed their marriage in the most fundamental way possible. Fourth, he drafted resignation letters for both Elaine and Morgan, to be submitted to their respective employers along with evidence of their activities that violated workplace conduct policies. Neil worked until 4 a.m., crafting the instruments of his family's professional and social destruction with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to managing shipping schedules. At 4:15 a.m., Elaine came home, moving quietly through the house like a teenager sneaking in after curfew. Neil heard her shower, then slip into their bedroom. He lay in the guest bed, listening to his wife prepare for sleep after a night of infidelity, and felt something final click into place in his chest. Tomorrow would begin their reckoning. Tuesday morning brought the first controlled detonation. Neil called Dylan at 7 a.m., before the younger man left for his job at the bank. "Dylan, it's Neil. We need to talk. Today. Mr. Hargrove, I don't think—" "Your wife gave you an STD she caught from another man. Your mother-in-law is having an affair with the same person who infected your wife. They're both lying to you about their activities and their intentions. We need to talk. Today." The silence on the other end of the call stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Where? Dylan's voice was barely audible. My office at the warehouse, noon, and Dylan, don't tell Morgan or Elaine about this conversation. Neil spent the morning organizing evidence into a presentation that would systematically destroy Dylan's illusions about his marriage, while providing him with legal ammunition for the divorce that was now inevitable. Dylan arrived at noon looking like he'd been awake for days. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking as he sat across from Neil's desk. How long have you known? Dylan asked. About a week for the full scope. I suspected something was wrong for about a month. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with before involving you, and I needed documentation that would hold up legally. Neil opened his laptop and began walking Dylan through the evidence. The Instagram photos, the dating app communications, the audio recordings of Elaine and Morgan discussing their activities. With each piece of evidence, Dylan's face grew paler and his breathing more shallow. They wanted to involve me in this? Dylan asked after hearing the restaurant conversation recording. According to their communications with Craig, that was always the plan. The goal was to gradually introduce you to their lifestyle and convince you that open marriage was a more evolved form of relationship. Dylan stared at his hands. Last night, Morgan tried to bring up the idea of exploring our boundaries. She said she'd been reading about couples who found new excitement by being more adventurous. What did you tell her? I told her I didn't understand what she meant. She got frustrated and started talking about how I never wanted to try new things, how I was holding her back from growing as a person. Dylan looked up at Neil with eyes full of pain and betrayal. She's been planning to cheat on me, and she wanted me to give her permission. Worse than that, she's already been cheating on you. She's infected you with an STD, and she was going to pretend that open marriage was her idea rather than something she'd already been participating in for months. Neil handed Dylan a manila folder containing copies of all the evidence, along with contact information for several divorce attorneys who specialized in infidelity cases. What are you going to do about Elaine? Dylan asked. That depends on what you decide to do about Morgan. I don't understand. Neil leaned back in his chair, studying his son-in-law's face. If you file for divorce immediately, citing infidelity and providing this evidence, it will trigger a public scandal that will destroy both Morgan and Elaine's reputations. If you decide to try reconciliation, or if you file quietly without evidence, they'll both claim they were innocent sufferers of Craig's manipulation. You want me to destroy my wife publicly? I want you to decide whether your wife deserves protection after what she's done to you. Dylan stared at the folder in his hands. If I file with this evidence, what happens to them? Morgan loses her job. Her employer has a morality clause for managers. Elaine probably loses hers too. Craig's dental practice collapses. Everyone in Cedar Hill learns exactly what kind of people they really are. And if I don't? They face no real consequences. They'll probably blame Craig for manipulating them, claim they were sufferers, and eventually find someone else to cheat with. Dylan opened the folder and flipped through the photographs Sandra Lawton had provided. Images of his wife in compromising positions with strangers, laughing and touching and engaging in intimacies she'd been denying him for months. I need some time to think, Dylan said finally. You have until Friday. After that, I'm moving forward with my own plans, regardless of what you decide. Dylan stood up slowly, clutching the folder like it contained explosives. Mr. Hargrove, why are you doing this? Why not just divorce Elaine quietly and move on? Neil considered the question carefully. Because people need to understand that choices have consequences. Because lies compound until they become systems of misuse. And because I loved my wife and daughter enough to expect better from them. Loved? Past tense? Yes, past tense. Wednesday brought a phone call that accelerated Neil's timeline. Tommy called at 8 a.m. with urgent news. Sandra Lawton filed for divorce yesterday afternoon. Craig knows his world is about to collapse, and my sources say he's planning to disappear, liquidate his assets, and relocate to a state that doesn't have reciprocal divorce enforcement. How long do we have? Maybe a week before he's gone. If you're going to move, it has to be now. Neil felt the timeline compress around him like a vice. What about the evidence Sandra provided? Still admissible, but Craig's disappearance will complicate any civil proceedings. Your wife and daughter will be able to claim they were abandoned sufferers rather than willing participants. Not if they're caught in the act of planning their next moves. Neil hung up and called Dylan immediately. It's Wednesday. Neil said when Dylan answered. I need your decision now, not Friday. I haven't had enough time to. Craig is planning to disappear within the week. If you don't act today, he'll vanish and leave Morgan and Elaine holding all the responsibility for their actions. They'll spend the rest of their lives claiming they were manipulated by a man who's no longer around to contradict their story. The silence stretched for 20 seconds. What do I need to do? Dylan asked finally. Meet me at my attorney's office in 2 hours. Bring the evidence folder and a checkbook. Neil spent the next hour implementing contingency plans he'd hoped to avoid. He transferred the remaining joint account funds to his personal accounts, changed the passwords on all their shared financial services, and executed the property trust transfer that would protect their house from divorce proceedings. By the time he met Dylan at the attorney's office, Neil had effectively isolated Elaine from their shared assets while maintaining legal legitimacy for every action. The attorney, Janet Pierce, specialized in high-conflict divorces involving infidelity. She reviewed Dylan's evidence with professional detachment, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. This is comprehensive, she said finally, more than enough to prove infidelity and justify immediate separation of assets. Mr. Hargrove, your situation is more complex because you haven't been directly damaged by your wife's infidelity in ways that Ohio law recognizes as actionable. What does that mean? Neil asked. It means Dylan can file for divorce with cause and receive favorable property division. You can file for divorce, but unless you can prove your wife infected you with an STD through her infidelity, Ohio's no-fault divorce laws will treat this as irreconcilable differences. Neil smiled grimly. She did infect me. She told her lover that she'd convinced me I was also infected, making me complicit in her deception. I have recordings of her discussing this strategy. Janet's eyebrows rose. That changes everything. Fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, possibly even attack if she attempted sexual contact while knowingly infected. How quickly can we move? I can have divorce papers filed for both of you today. The infidelity evidence will be submitted simultaneously, creating a public record before Craig disappears. Your wives will be served tomorrow morning. Neil looked at Dylan, who was staring at his wedding ring with the expression of a man watching his life collapse in real time. Dylan, Neil said gently, once we do this, there's no going back. Are you sure? Dylan pulled off his wedding ring and set it on Janet's desk. I'm sure. Thursday morning, Neil woke early and made coffee with unusual care. Today would be the last morning of his marriage, and he wanted to remember exactly how it felt to perform domestic routines in a house that had once contained love. Elaine emerged from their bedroom at 7:30, already dressed for work. She moved through their kitchen with the efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere. I'll be working late tonight, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. Don't wait dinner for me. Of course not, Neil replied. I wouldn't want to interfere with your schedule. Something in his tone made her pause, but before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Neil watched through the window as Elaine opened the front door to receive divorce papers from a professional process server. Her face went through several distinct stages of shock, confusion, and dawning horror as she read the documents. Neil. Her voice carried a note of panic he'd never heard before. Neil, what is this? He joined her in the foyer, noting how the divorce papers trembled in her hands. Those appear to be legal documents, he said calmly. This says you're divorcing me for infidelity. It says I gave you an STD through extramarital affairs. This is insane. Is it? Elaine stared at him, her mind working frantically behind her eyes. You can't possibly believe I've been unfaithful. We talked about the STD. We agreed it was probably dormant. We agreed that's what you wanted me to believe. Neil pulled out his phone and played the recording of Craig describing how he'd convinced Elaine to implicate Neil in the infection. Elaine's face went white as Craig's voice filled their foyer, detailing her manipulation with clinical precision. You recorded me, she whispered. I recorded a lot of things. Neil played another clip, Elaine's voice describing him as pathetic, too absorbed in work to notice her betrayal. You've been planning this, Elaine said, her voice rising. You've been spying on me for weeks. I've been protecting myself from a wife who was systematically destroying our marriage while trying to make me complicit in her deception. Elaine sank onto their stairs, still clutching the divorce papers. How long have you known? About Craig? About a month? About the full extent of what you and Morgan were planning? About 2 weeks. Morgan! Elaine's face crumpled as she understood the implications. Oh, God. Morgan. Dylan filed for divorce yesterday. Morgan was served this morning at her office in front of her colleagues. The cruelty of that detail wasn't accidental. Neil had specifically requested that Morgan be served at work, ensuring maximum humiliation and professional damage. Elaine began crying, not the delicate tears of a woman seeking sympathy, but the harsh sobs of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. "Please," she said through her tears. "We can fix this. I can explain everything. Craig manipulated us. He made us believe things that weren't true." "Play the recording again, Elaine. Listen to your own voice describing how pathetic your husband is. Listen to yourself laugh about infecting me with an STD. Then tell me how you were manipulated." Neil's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. "Craig cleared out his bank accounts this morning. He's running." "Your boyfriend just disappeared," Neil said, showing Elaine the message. "Liquidated his assets and fled the state. Left you and Morgan to face the consequences alone." Elaine read the text, her sobs intensifying. "He said he loved me. He said we had a future together. He said a lot of things. Most of them were lies designed to make you easier to exploit." Neil knelt beside his wife, studying her face with the detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. "The terrible thing is that I would have forgiven the affair," he said quietly, "if you'd been honest about your unhappiness. If you'd asked for marriage counseling, if you'd shown any respect for our relationship, I would have worked with you to fix whatever was broken." Elaine looked up at him with desperate hope. "But you didn't just have an affair," Neil continued. "You recruited our daughter. You planned to involve Dylan. You gave me an STD and tried to make me believe I was responsible. You called me pathetic while plotting to destroy our son-in-law's marriage. Those aren't mistakes, Elaine. They're choices that reveal who you really are." Neil stood up, straightening his tie with the same precision he used for important warehouse meetings. "I'm going to work now," he said. "When I come home tonight, I expect you to be gone. Your attorney will be in touch about property division, but given the evidence of your infidelity and fraud, I wouldn't expect much." Elaine grabbed his leg as he tried to walk past her. "Please don't do this. We can go to counseling. We can rebuild. I'll do anything." Neil gently extracted himself from her grip. 24 hours ago, you were planning to convince Dylan to participate in your lifestyle arrangement. 18 hours ago, you were texting Craig about your next meeting. You're not sorry about betraying me, Elaine. You're sorry about getting caught. He left her crying on their stairs and drove to work, feeling lighter than he had in months. At the warehouse, Neil conducted business with unusual focus and efficiency. He approved shipping schedules, resolved driver disputes, and negotiated delivery contracts with the satisfaction of a man whose personal life had finally achieved the same organizational clarity as his professional responsibilities. His phone rang constantly, calls from Elaine, from Morgan, from numbers he didn't recognize. He ignored them all. At 3 p.m., Tommy called with an update. "Craig's dental practice is in chaos," Tommy reported. Sandra's divorce filing included fraud allegations related to his professional finances. The state dental board suspended his license pending investigation. His patients are being transferred to other practices. What about Morgan? Fired this morning. Her employer cited the morality clause in her management contract. Apparently, being served divorce papers for infidelity at work violated their standards for executive behavior. Neil felt a pang of something that might have been regret, but it passed quickly. Morgan had made her choices with full awareness of the risks. "Dylan's holding up better than expected," Tommy continued. "He's staying with his friend Rick, but he asked me to tell you he appreciates what you did. What I did was give him information. He made his own decisions. Still, he wanted you to know." Neil returned home that evening to find the house empty. Elaine had removed her clothes, toiletries, and personal items, but left everything else untouched. The refrigerator still contained his favorite foods. His coffee mug sat clean and ready in the dish drainer. Even in exile, she was taking care of him. Neil found a note on their kitchen table, written in Elaine's careful handwriting. "Neil, I know you'll never forgive me, but I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go this far. Craig made it all seem so sophisticated and modern. He convinced me that you and I had grown apart and that exploring other relationships would help me appreciate what we had together. I was selfish and stupid, but I wasn't trying to hurt you. I know you don't believe me, but I do love you. I've loved you for 23 years, even when I was destroying our marriage. I just forgot how to show it in ways that mattered. I'm staying at my sister's house in Columbus until I can figure out what comes next. My attorney says the divorce will be final in 6 months. I won't contest anything. You deserve to keep everything we built together. Please don't destroy Morgan completely. She's young and she made terrible mistakes, but she's still our daughter. She needs her father now more than ever. I'm sorry. For all of it. I'm sorry. Elaine Neal read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet next to the Pine Shore Resort receipt that had started everything. He poured himself bourbon and sat in his office, surrounded by evidence of his family's destruction, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but approached it. Friday brought news that Craig had been arrested in Nevada for practicing dentistry without a license. Apparently, he'd been so confident in his escape plan that he'd immediately set up a new practice using forged credentials. He'll be extradited back to Ohio to face fraud charges, Tommy explained during their final meeting. Sandra's divorce attorney has frozen all his remaining assets, so he won't be able to afford competent legal representation. What's the timeline for his prosecution? Probably 18 months before trial, but his reputation is destroyed permanently. Word spreads fast in professional communities. Neal nodded, satisfied that Craig would face meaningful consequences for his carnivory behavior. What about my case? Neal asked. Elaine's attorney contacted Janet yesterday. They want to settle without admitting fault, but they're willing to give you essentially everything. The house, the retirement accounts, even spousal support. They just want the infidelity allegations to disappear from public record. No, Tommy looked surprised. No to which part? No to making the infidelity allegations disappear. I want everything in public record permanently. I want anyone who searches Elaine's name to find documentation of what she did. That's going to cost you financially. Her attorney will fight harder if you insist on public humiliation. Then we'll fight harder back. Tommy studied Neal's face. This isn't about the money anymore, is it? It was never about the money. The divorce proceedings stretched over 6 months, with Elaine's attorney fighting desperately to seal court records and minimize public disclosure. Neal's attorney fought back with equal determination, ensuring that every detail of Elaine's infidelity became part of permanent legal record. During this time, Neal received occasional updates about his daughter's situation. Morgan had moved back to Columbus with Elaine, sharing a small apartment and working part-time jobs that didn't require management experience. Dylan had filed a restraining order against her after she'd attempted to contact him repeatedly, claiming she could explain everything if he'd just listen. Neal felt no urge to contact Morgan himself. She'd made her choices with full awareness of their implications. If she wanted forgiveness, she could earn it through actions rather than explanations. The final divorce hearing took place on a cold Tuesday in March. Neal arrived at the courthouse wearing his best suit, carrying a briefcase containing 6 months of legal preparation. Elaine sat at the defendant's table, looking thin and tired. She'd aged visibly during their separation, her face showing the kind of stress that comes from public humiliation and financial uncertainty. When their eyes met across the courtroom, she offered a tentative smile that Neal didn't return. The judge reviewed the evidence methodically, occasionally asking questions about specific allegations. The infidelity was documented beyond dispute. The STD transmission was proven through medical records and audio recordings. The fraud was established through Elaine's recorded admission of intentional deception. This is one of the more comprehensive cases of marital misconduct I've encountered, the judge said finally. The defendant's actions show a pattern of deception that extends beyond simple infidelity to systematic fraud and emotional misuse. The final judgment awarded Neal the house, both retirement accounts, Elaine's car, and monthly spousal support that would continue until she remarried or died. Elaine received her clothes, personal items, and the remaining balance in her individual checking account, approximately $347. More importantly, the infidelity finding would remain in public record permanently, ensuring that any future employer or romantic partner would have access to documentation of her character. Outside the courthouse, Elaine approached Neal one final time. I know you hate me, she said quietly. But I want you to know that I understand why. You were a good husband, and I threw it away for something that wasn't even real. Neal looked at his ex-wife, this woman who'd shared his life for over 2 decades and then systematically destroyed it, and felt only tired indifference. I don't hate you, Elaine. Hate requires caring about someone's actions. You're just a stranger now. Elaine's face crumpled, but Neal was already walking away. 6 months later, Neal received a phone call that brought the final piece of closure he hadn't known he needed. Dylan called on a Saturday evening in September, his voice stronger than Neil had heard it since the divorce proceedings began. "I wanted to let you know that I'm engaged," Dylan said. "Her name is Sarah, and she's nothing like Morgan. She's honest, completely brutally honest about everything. I'm happy for you. I also wanted to thank you for showing me the truth before I wasted more years on a marriage that was built on lies." Neil considered this. "You don't need to thank me. I was protecting myself. You benefited, but that wasn't my primary motivation. I know. That's what made your help trustworthy. You weren't trying to save me. You were just showing me reality." "What are you going to do about Morgan?" "Nothing. She sends letters sometimes, trying to explain or apologize. I don't read them. Sarah helped me understand that some people aren't capable of the kind of honesty that real relationships require." After Dylan hung up, Neil sat in his office, the same room where he'd planned his family's destruction, and reflected on the year that had passed. The house felt different now, cleaner, more peaceful. He'd removed all traces of Elaine and Morgan, donating their abandoned belongings to charity and repainting rooms in colors that reflected his preferences rather than compromises. His work had improved dramatically. Without the constant stress of maintaining a marriage built on lies, he'd been promoted to regional logistics director, overseeing warehouse operations across 3 states. He dated occasionally, but found himself uninterested in serious relationships. Too many women seemed to view honesty as optional, treating truth like a negotiation rather than a foundation. The phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Hargrove, this is Detective Martinez with Cedar Hill Police. I'm calling about Craig Lawton." Neil's attention sharpened. "What about him?" "He was found dead in his cell yesterday morning. Apparent self-destruction. He left a note specifically mentioning you and several other men whose families he'd targeted over the years." "What did the note say?" "Mostly confessions to fraud and manipulation. But he wanted certain people to know that he'd documented everything. All his sufferers, all his methods, all the families he'd destroyed. He said the information was hidden somewhere and would be found eventually." Neil felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Detective, are you saying there might be more evidence of his activities?" "We found a storage unit registered under a false name. It contained files on over 30 families, including yours. Photos, recordings, financial information, years of material. What happens to it now? It becomes evidence in ongoing investigations. Some of these families never knew they'd been targeted. Some of the sufferers were minors." Neil absorbed this information, understanding that Craig's carnivory behavior had been far more extensive and systematic than anyone had realized. "Detective, will this information be made public?" "Some of it will be released as part of legal proceedings. Families have a right to know what was done to them." After the detective hung up, Neil poured himself bourbon and contemplated the implications. Craig's passing meant there would never be a trial, never be justice in the traditional sense. But his confession and documentation would provide closure for dozens of families who'd been manipulated and destroyed by a hunter disguised as a respectable professional. Neil's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dad, I saw the news about Craig. Can we please talk? I understand things now that I didn't before. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Morgan Neil read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Some trust, once destroyed, couldn't be restored. Some choices carried permanent consequences. That was the lesson Craig had learned too late. The lesson Elaine and Morgan were still learning. The lesson Neil had internalized completely. He finished his bourbon and went to bed in his quiet house, sleeping peacefully for the first time in over a year. 3 months later, Neil received a final communication from his former family. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed in Morgan's handwriting but bearing no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message. "Dad, I know you won't respond to this, but I need you to know that Mom died yesterday. The infection from last year came back, and she was too proud to seek treatment until it was too late. Her last words were about you. She said to tell you that she finally understood what she'd lost. I'm moving to Oregon next week, starting over somewhere nobody knows what I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I think about you every day. I understand now that you weren't cruel. You were just honest about consequences. I hope someday I can be the kind of person who deserves a father like you." Morgan Neil read the letter once, then placed it in his safe beside Elaine's final note and the Pine Shore Resort receipt that had started everything. He felt no satisfaction in Elaine's passing. No grief, either. Just a quiet recognition that some stories end with justice, some with tragedy, and some with the simple acknowledgement that choices shape destiny more powerfully than intentions ever could. That evening, Neil drove to the cemetery where Elaine had been buried beside her parents. He stood at her grave for exactly 5 minutes, saying nothing, feeling nothing, remembering the woman she'd been before she'd chosen to become someone else. Then he returned to his truck and drove home to his quiet house, leaving the past buried where it belonged. On his kitchen table, he found a package from Dylan and Sarah, their wedding invitation, along with a note asking if he'd consider walking Sarah down the aisle since her father had passed away years earlier. Neil smiled for the first time in months. Some endings created space for new beginnings. Some honesty led to deeper trust. Some people learned from other people's mistakes. He called Dylan immediately. "I'd be honored," Neil said when Dylan answered. "Really?" "Really. When's the wedding?" "June 15th. Small ceremony, just family and close friends." "I'll be there." After hanging up, Neil sat in his kitchen, surrounded by the silence of a life rebuilt on truth rather than compromise. Outside, spring rain began falling, washing the winter salt from his windows and preparing the ground for whatever would grow next. He opened his laptop and began composing a response to Dylan and Sarah's invitation, looking forward to witnessing a marriage that would begin with honesty and build towards something real. Behind him, Elaine's photograph smiled from the mantelpiece, the last picture they'd taken together, back when he'd still believed their marriage was based on mutual respect rather than mutual deception. Tomorrow, he would take that picture down and store it with the other artifacts of his previous life. Tonight, he would finish his letter and plan for a future where truth mattered more than convenience. Neil typed steadily, his words precise and careful, building something new from the ruins of everything he'd been forced to destroy. The end.